Welcome to Forbes Newsroom. Joining me now is Steve Forbes, Chairman and Editor-in-Chief of Forbes Media. Steve, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Of course. So as we sit here right now, we are just days away from the midterm elections. And recent polling has shown that Republicans are poised to take control back of the House and Senate. How did this happen?
I think it happened because of the economy and worries about inflation, which are hitting people every day, the constant reassurances from the Federal Reserve and from the Biden administration that things were getting better, that it was only transitory. Obviously, people are feeling it harder and harder. So that's the big issue. There's also a feeling the country's not going in the right direction. Those poll numbers are extraordinary. So the focus on those issues, the economy, where the country is going, is why the GOP is poised to take control both of the House of Representatives and, amazingly, control of the Senate. Also, will be interesting will be the governor's races in various states, including New York State. These are very blue states, but in a couple of them you could see Republicans winning, which would be a huge surprise.
So what do you think is the top issue for voters?
The top issue is the economy. Top issue is the inflation and the feeling that things are going to get worse, not better. The feeling that next year we're going to have a slow year, not a boom year. The consumer surveys are really in the tank. And so when people feel that economically things are not going well, they will take action at the polls.
And historically, when the economy isn't doing so hot, is this usually the top of mind issue for voters?
The economy usually is the top of mind. Famously, back in 1992, when Bill Clinton first ran for president, his campaign manager said, "It's the economy, stupid, exclamation mark." That's the issue they used against the incumbent, George H.W. Bush, and they beat him on the economic issue. The economy had been in a mild recession. Even though the economy is starting to recover, voters felt that things weren't going well, and so an incumbent lost the presidency. So you're going to find a lot of people in the House and the Senate and in governor's chairs, incumbents are going to lose because of the feeling that the economy is not going in the right direction. And the news from overseas about the economy around the world is not reassuring.
And so the economy the economy grew 2.6% this third quarter, but did shrink the first two quarters. Do you think this is enough for Democrats to point to and say, hey, this is turning around, we're going in a new direction, or is this too little too late?
Well, in terms of people seeing GDP numbers, those are abstractions. What they see is what they pay at the marketplace, what they pay at the gas pump. Gas prices did go down, then they started to go up again. The president took credit when they went down, suddenly going up. Bad Vladimir Putin's at it again. And so voters, I think, are going to take it out on the incumbents. They don't feel that they're in charge. They don't feel they have the right policies. So in that sense, the third quarter GDP number is not reassuring. And as a matter of fact, most economists look in terms of those GDP numbers at a number called final sales. And that shows the real direction of the economy. In the first quarter of the year, even though the GDP number was down, the final sales number was still growing at a 2% annual rate. Second quarter went down to 0.5%, and the third quarter was 0.1%, 0.1%. The reason GDP went up was because of trade numbers, the way we count trade in the GDP, government spending we count in the way we do a GDP, inventories. But in terms of final sales, the trend is definitely downward.
And White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said earlier this week that President Biden isn't planning for a recession. So do you think, as a whole, the White House and Democratic lawmakers alike are really downplaying economic concerns that Americans are feeling?
Of course, the Democrats are playing down economic concerns. I think they're over trying to pretend that if they say things are going well, people say they're going well. Again, when people go to the gas pump or to the grocery store, they see that things are not going well. And a lot of people have taken 2 jobs, 3 jobs to make up for the loss of purchasing power. Prices are going up at 8% a year, and wages are going up at about 4.5%, 5% a year. So even though the pay packets, as they call them, are moving up, the purchasing power is going down. And that's got people worried that we're not in control, that they're losing ground, and that's why they're going to take it out in the polls, get policies that start to work. When they say the president's not planning for a recession, the question is, what would he do about it? The only thing he knows what to do about it is to spend more money. But people now realize that when you spend money, the government has to pay for it. And the way they pay for it is either through taxes or by printing money. And printing money leads to higher prices.
And no one wants that. Definitely, voters do not want higher prices. But over the summer, it really seemed like Democrats were gaining momentum for the midterms, especially in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned. So where did they go wrong in their messaging from then until now? And where did Republicans go right to be poised to take control of both chambers of Congress?
Well, after the initial reaction to the Supreme Court decision, voters began to realize in states around the country that the matter is now in the hands of states. And most states are going to permit abortion. They'll probably have restrictions of 12 to 15 weeks like European countries do, but abortion will still be available in most states. And so the concern that it was being abolished rather than the issue being determined by state governments, I think people initially thought, oh, this means abortion is being banned. No, it just means those decisions will be made by state legislatures, state governors, not by the Supreme Court. So in that sense, things have calmed down a bit on that. It's New York is not going to do away with abortion, nor is New Jersey or other states. So people are now refocusing on the economy now that they know that in terms of the future of that issue, it's in local hands, state hands, or not the courts, but the availability is still there.
And I do want to get your take on a really tight Senate race, happens to be my home state of Pennsylvania, and that's against Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman and Dr. Oz. Who do you think is going to claim victory in that race?
I will make a prediction, but I'm not going to bet a penny of my 401k on it because the Republican primary was so fierce that Dr. Oz's negatives were through the roof. That primary really set it up for a Democratic win. But unfortunately for the Democrats, the lieutenant governor had a stroke back in May. And instead of dropping out of the race and allowing another candidate, which they could have done until a few weeks ago, they could have substituted another candidate. Instead, it focused on whether he's got the health to be able to do the job as a senator. And there are very real concerns about it, but also, too, his past stands, especially on an issue like fracking. Fracking is a very big industry in Pennsylvania. The state has collected over the years billions of dollars in royalties. Over 50,000 jobs are dependent on fracking. And so he was against it. Then he tried to sort of say, well, no, I was really for it, even though I said I was against. He made a muddle of it. So people wonder whether he's too far left for most voters in Pennsylvania. So Dr. Oz has negatives. John Fetterman has got negatives, and so it's going to be get out the vote. So I think Oz will narrowly win, but it's one of those things that could go either way. People are not enamored with either candidate, and I think that's going to be, and also the governor's race, the Democrat is ahead there. So will people split ballots? All up in the air. But I think the Republicans will narrowly win. But if they do win, if Dr. Oz wins, you have to keep in mind that means they retain a Republican seat. It's not a gain. It's just retaining.
And you talked about ticket splitting there, and I know that the race there is neck and neck between Oz and Fetterman, but the Democrat Josh Shapiro is really pulling ahead of Doug Mastriano, the Republican. So do you think weak gubernatorial candidates in general, like Doug Mastriano, help or hurt the party's Senate nominations?
Well, people have learned over the years to split their ballots. And I think in Pennsylvania, you're going to see a distinction between knowing that the governor's race is about issues in Pennsylvania, the Senate race is about issues nationally. And Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, if he wins the Senate seat, the Republicans have been hammering home. That'll mean he'll vote for higher taxes. He'll vote for more spending. He'll vote for the kind of policies that gave us the economic problems we have today. So I think people make the distinction between what are we doing statewide and what are we doing nationally. So I think you will see a lot of ticket splitting. One of the amazing things about voting in blue states like Massachusetts or Vermont is that even though they're very, very blue, they do elect often Republicans as governors because they're dealing with state issues and they like somebody to, they don't want total one-party control. So you have a Bernie Sanders' home state, you have a Republican governor, a very popular one. You have an outgoing, very popular governor in Massachusetts. So people, I think, have learned to make a distinction between state and national issues.
Now, I do want to talk about the Senate as a whole. So let's say the GOP takes control of the Senate. Do you think they're going to vote for McConnell as leader?
I think the Republicans will keep McConnell in. But they recognizing that he'll probably be stepping down in 4 years. And why have a fight? I don't think he's going to be challenged by any of the other senators, so he'll get it. In terms of then what happens if the Republicans gain control of both houses, they'll take, as you know, formal control in early January. And what will they do then? I think you'll see several main thrusts. One, of course, is they're going to vote to remove the obstacles to develop oil and gas on federal lands. If President Biden vetoes it, they'll say, gee, he wants oil from Venezuela and OPEC, but he won't take it from here at home. So I think there's a chance that could actually become law. They'll try to make permanent the tax cuts that were passed in 2017, but because of the bizarre rules they have in Washington, a lot of those tax cuts expire in the next year or two, especially allowing businesses to have incentives for investing. So they'll take that up. And the other thing they'll do is defund, you might say, the IRS from hiring 80,000 new agents. They're going to do that. And I think they'll put that in in a general appropriations bill, so it's not something the president can veto individually. But one issue, Brittany, that's going to be very, very interesting, it did not come up in the election campaign, but it's going to be national defense. Which will focus on the issue of what do we do for Ukraine? Do we continue to give arms to Ukraine? Unfortunately, a lot of Republicans and certain Democrats are going against that. And that's what Vladimir Putin is counting on, that there'll be political fatigue in those who are supplying weapons to Ukraine. So even though it was not an election issue, it is going to be, I think, a major issue next year. What should be the defense posture of the United States? Should we continue to help out Ukraine? Because that'll have an impact on Iran. That'll have an impact on China. It'll have an impact on North Korea. And the other thing that happened was the recent victory of just a few hours ago of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. He'll have a solid majority in the Knesset there. And in the next 12 to 18 months, Israel's going to have to make a real decision on what they do about Iran getting the bomb. And they're going to have to make a decision whether they accept that or whether they take military action against it. So even though these issues were not prominent in the campaign, they are going to be in 2024, and they are going to be right in front of us in 2023, as North Korea continues to lob missiles in the air.
Yeah, and I want to get back to Ukraine. Kevin McCarthy said, or he suggested, that if the GOP retains control of, or takes control of the House, they're going to stop sending aid to Ukraine. Do you think that's a smart move?
I think the point he was trying to make is they're going to look very closely to make sure where the money is going and that kind of thing. I think McCarthy himself, Representative McCarthy himself, knows we must continue to help Ukraine because it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the security of Europe and indeed the security of the free world, because Vladimir Putin's ambitions extend far beyond Ukraine. And he'll then, if he conquers Ukraine, he'll then be pushing on countries that he thinks should be under Russian control, like Poland. That's why the Poles are going all out for Ukraine. What they call the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, which were once part of the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, now independent states. Putin's going to start pushing on them. So this is going to lead to a very, very real crisis. And so you're going to get a real debate on Ukraine. A lot of Republicans, and as we saw the other day, a certain number of Democrats in the House want to defund helping Ukraine and help Vladimir Putin. And I think that's going to be a big issue. But I do hope and I think that the Congress will end up doing the right thing but it's going to be a lot of debate. And I think the American people are going to end up deciding it's not just Ukraine, it's about ultimately our own security. And I think you'll hear more about the 1930s when we ignored Hitler taking Austria, Hitler taking Czechoslovakia, and stopping these people before a real disaster happens.
Of course, and Kevin McCarthy's comments on Ukraine really were a news cycle when he said them. Do you think, let's say the GOP does take control of the House, that will cost him a potential speaker role?
No. I think he's done a real balancing act between the various factions of the GOP, so he won't be challenged. I think a lot of those who might have challenged him in the past realize you better have unity or you're going to lose it all. So he'll be elected as the next speaker. But the question then becomes, what are they going to vote on in terms of the military? Even if you don't like helping Ukraine, it is becoming very clear our military today is in very bad shape, especially the Navy and the Air Force, very short on armaments. Some of our enlisted people are getting food stamps to survive. So there's going to be a lot of attention paid. How do we rebuild the military? And I think ultimately it's going to have to be the kind of program we had in the early 80s when the military fell apart in the 70s and under Ronald Reagan was rebuilt in the 1980s. That's going to have to sadly be done again because we neglected it.
Do you think that will be a big issue that they focus on in 2023?
I think so. They're going to up what the Biden administration is proposing. They are already making an issue when you hear them ask the question about the U.S. Navy. China's Navy is expanding rapidly. They have more ships than we do. And at a time when we still say the South China Sea, which is international waters, very, very important for global trade. China says it's their, they own it now. They say it's not international anymore. And at a time when China is going to try to enforce that through a bigger Navy, we're reducing the size of our Navy. And so the Biden administration is projecting in real terms cutting defense spending in coming years, when it's very clear with the way the world situation is today, we should be going in the opposite direction. So yes, it'll become more and more of a presidential issue as that race heats up next year, and also be one that Congress deals with when they pass appropriations bills for the Defense Department.
And right now, you just laid out a ton of international crises. Which one do you think is the biggest issue that the U.S. faces?
Well, the most immediate one is Ukraine. They have demonstrated that with the right weaponry and in sufficient numbers, they can beat the Russians. And so that has to continue. Putin is counting on putting pressure by cutting off or slowing oil and gas deliveries to Europe, and by fooling around with grain supplies, letting them go through and then blocking them and games like that, and fatigue in the U.S. about helping Ukraine. I think he's counting on a political victory. He can't win it on the battlefield alone, but he's counting on political fatigue in the U.S. to get a victory that he couldn't on the battlefield. But also another big crisis that's going to be coming up that is going to have international implications is economic. Japan is still trying to keep low interest rates, which that low interest rate policy that we put in with Ben Bernanke at the Fed has been a disaster, led to huge distortions in the marketplace. A lot of governments are now way over indebted. Japan's national debt is twice that proportionally as our own. And if they continue to try to suppress interest rates, they're going to have a huge inflation problem coming up. Europe, Italy's debt is all through the stratosphere, worse than our own proportionately. And so the European Central Bank's going to have a problem there. Britain is already in a terrible situation. And so you're going to have a situation where you're going to have an international crisis, countries not able to service their debts, countries in recession, including developing countries. I think that's going to lead to the major countries coming together and trying to find a way at least to stabilize exchange rates. Because if you don't have stable exchange rates, then it's very hard to do trade if exporters and importers don't know what they're going to get paid in, because trying to hedge against that kind of volatility is extremely expensive. And so you're going to have that headwind hitting the economy. So you've got economic crises coming up. I'm not sure the Federal Reserve has fully grasped that what they do here just doesn't stay here. It has global implications. And so you're going to have a real crisis there. So there's going to be plenty to write about next year, and plenty of crises coming up, both here at home and overseas, whether it's Ukraine or the global economic crisis.
Is inflation going to get worse before it gets better?
It'll probably tread about the same, which is still pretty bad. But what the Fed doesn't realize is that they've already baked in, so to speak, a downturn next year. We're like a freighter, a big ship. When you change course, it takes a while for the ship to actually change course. And I think the U.S. is already treading water economically. And I think that next year, even the economic theologians will conclude that we are in a recession. And the Federal Reserve was slow in responding to inflation. And now they're overreacting to inflation in a way in which is going to do unnecessary damage. Unfortunately, the Federal Reserve believes that the way you conquer inflation is not by stabilizing the dollar, but by hurting the economy, making people poor, increasing unemployment. They've as much as said that. And economists as much as say it, that you got to inflict pain to conquer inflation. It's nonsense, but that's the prevailing belief.
So, Steve, let's say you were Jerome Powell right this second. What would you immediately do to help curb inflation?
Well, he's not going to quit or apologize, but what he should do is make it clear on interest rates. That'll be set by the marketplace, not try to be controlled by the Fed, which has been a disaster. And he should say we're going to focus on stabilizing the dollar and other exchange rates, and we're not going to try to throw the economy into a recession. Because if you look at some economists are called monetarists. They look at what they call the money supply. And the most popular measure is called M2. Well, during the COVID and the lockdowns, when the Fed was printing money and Congress was spending money to fairly well, M2 grew at an annual rate of 30–40%, absolutely unprecedented. Well, that's gone in the opposite direction. It has shown no growth since December, actually declined since March. Now, the monetarists will tell you there's a 12 to 18-month lag time between when you get those changes and when it shows up in the marketplace. So the increase in M2 during COVID showed up this year, but the slowdown in M2 now will show up next year in a recession. You look at the gold price, which is very, very sensitive future barometer. That has actually gone down in price, which means there's actually a liquidity shortage in the economy. So we're still going to have higher prices, but we're also going to have a declining economy. And the 1970s was the last time we had that. It was called stagflation. So we're going to be dusting off that word, stagflation, next year, a slowing economy and rising prices.
That doesn't sound too great that's not a good outlook or a great outlook for 2023 in terms of the economy, unfortunately. But I do want to rattle off to you some races that are tight for the midterms coming up. And can you? Go ahead.
Let me just say on 2023 and the hard winter we're going to get is that the very events are going to bring about positive changes in economic policy, just as the harsh events of the late 1970s brought about the policy changes in the 1980s that enabled us to have a great boom. So I think in the next 2 years, we'll see the terrible 20s turn into the roaring 20s.
Well, I'd love to hear that. So on to some races in the that are tight for the midterms. So first, let's kick it off. Pennsylvania Senate race. I know you said you're not betting your 401k on it, but if you had to pick John Fetterman or Dr. Oz?
I'll say Dr. Oz.
Georgia
subject to change in the next 10 minutes.
Well, we will keep it open there. What about the Georgia Senate race? Senator Raphael Warnock or Herschel Walker?
I think amazingly, and the Senate Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, expressed it. He didn't know he had a hot mic the other day.
Yep.
That amazingly, it looks like Herschel Walker could pull it off, even though there have been a lot of ugly stories about his past. Again, I think people are focusing on the future. Who's likely to want to curb inflationary spending, Walker or Warnock? I think they'll go for Walker on that basis. So looking to the future, I think Walker will eke out a victory in Georgia. And I think Governor Kemp will win a decisive victory against his Democratic opponent.
Let's say the economy was in better shape. Do you think that those stories about Herschel Walker would sink him as a candidate?
They would certainly have more impact, because if the economy was doing well, people would say, why rock the boat? It seems that we're moving in the right direction. But now people are worried now that we're in the wrong direction. And so they want to, and Warnock has been supporting those policies. Senator Warnock has been supporting those policies that put us in the wrong direction. So people will be focused. They're unhappy now. Who's likely to vote for the things that will make for better times ahead economically in terms of spending and taxes and regulations?
Now, another close race, the Nevada Senate race. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto or Adam Laxalt?
I think Laxalt will win that one.
Wisconsin, Senator Ron Johnson or Mandela Barnes?
Ron Johnson.
And finally, the Arizona governor's race, Democrat Katie Hobbs or Republican Kari Lake?
I think there in Arizona is one of those states, almost like Pennsylvania, topsy-turvy, very real strange politics there. But I think the Republican Lake will eke out a victory, again, because the current incumbent, Governor Ducey, has done amazingly good things. He slashed the state income tax, and even the Democrats are starting to say maybe they won't tamper with that. He put in a radical, great new school program, education savings accounts, where parents get to choose, direct the money to the school of their choice. And I think that's going to end up to improving public schools, because now the schools know that they have competition and the parents can easily make a change. I think other states are going to follow suit on that. So the great record of Governor Ducey, I think, will enable Lake to eke out a victory.
So out of every single race in the midterms coming up, what has surprised you the most so far?
What has surprised me the most is how the economic situation got so much worse that it's turned political races that should have been for the Democrats into tight races that could go the opposite direction, could go flip from blue to red. And in Illinois, you have a governor's race. Everyone favors Governor Pritzker, but some people are saying that the economic situation in Illinois, even though Pritzker is ahead, is so bad that even the dead may start to vote Republican. So we'll see on that. But it was the decisive turn on the economy, and the messing up by the Biden administration on their economic message, that when they said things were going well, we've got this under control, and manifestly we didn't have it under control. So there's no trust in President Biden on economic issues. The polls show that. That is the number one issue. That's what's going to be the determinant in most of these races.
So the economy, like you were saying, is top of mind for voters. Is this similar to any other midterms in the past?
You've had issues like the economy in the past. Back in 2010, in the first term of President Obama, he passed Obamacare, which was very, very unpopular. The economy was not doing well, was not making a good recovery from the recession. Usually, if you have a steep downturn, you get a vigorous upturn, at least for a while. And the question becomes, can you sustain it? But you always get a big bounce back. We did not get a big bounce back after the recession of 2008, 2009. And so in 2010, that was a topmost issue, economic issue. And as President Obama said after the election, his party took a shellacking. They lost over 60 seats. Amazing turnaround. So you've seen it in the past, going back in dinosaur days, 1958, under Dwight Eisenhower, the economy was in recession, and the Republicans took a drubbing. So if the economy's not doing well, especially in midterm elections, where people can focus on one prime issue, you've seen in the past, it can make for very dramatic changes.
So, Steve, one final prediction. What's the balance of power looking like both in the House and Senate come Tuesday night?
The balance of power will shift to the Republicans, and which is a surprise, especially in the Senate, because there are more Republican seats up for grabs this year. As you know, 1/3 of the Senate comes up every 2 years. And so there are disproportionately large number of Republicans seats coming up. And usually that would have been good news for the Democrats. Going back to 1982, do a little history here. The Republicans, Ronald Reagan was president, the Republicans lost seats in the House of Representatives. But because of the makeup of the Senate races, even though the economy was in recession and the Republicans lost seats in the House, they gained seats in the U.S. Senate. So this should have been a pickup for Chuck Schumer and the Democrats. Instead, it looks like they could end up with a net loss of 1, 2, even as many as 3 seats.
Well, Steve Forbes, thank you so much for your insights. I look forward to seeing how it all plays out come Tuesday.
Well, we'll all be experts. I would normally say we'll all be experts by Wednesday, but given the way they count votes these days, maybe it'll be Wednesday of the week after or the week after that before we know.
Yeah, well, and whenever that is, I hope you come back and we can rehash it then.
Look forward to it. Thank you, Brittany.